class, for the persuasive video assignment, I'm going to be discussing the policy of decriminalization of drug use. This presentation will include a synopsis of the drug decriminalization policy, data regarding the existence of a drug problem, pros and cons of decriminalizing drug use, statistical data supporting why drugs should not be decriminalized, which will be my alternate viewpoint for this presentation, followed by my references. To begin, with a synopsis of drug decriminalization policy, decriminalizing drugs would include eliminating criminal penalties for drug use and possession, possessions of materials used to insert drugs into the body, like syringes, and low-level drug sales of less than a specified amount. An example of that might be here in Oregon, they have changed the law so someone can have less than an ounce of marijuana and sell it to someone else without there being a criminal penalty. So that might be an example of how the decriminalization of drugs would come into play with the low-level drug sales not getting any criminal penalties. I do want to point out that legalization is different than decriminalization. So these individuals who are in possession of drugs and using drugs would not be put into jail. However, they would still be required to go to drug treatment or counseling, so it wouldn't be considered legal for them to use these drugs. They just would not be put into jail. It'd be a different type of response. So definitely important to consider that decriminalization does not equal legalization. Data regarding existence of a drug problem. So according to Duke 2009, the United States has the highest rate of imprisonment in the world. The rate of imprisonment in the United States has increased by 500% since the war on drugs started in 1973 with Nixon. Each year, there are more than 1.6 million drug-related arrests in the United States, and more than 85% of this amount is for possession of drugs only, not for dealing. So that helps you understand how much the drug issue is affecting not only our society as a whole, but specifically within the incarceration system too. So what are the pros of decriminalizing drug use? To begin, the money saved from not incarcerating someone or putting them in jail for drug use or possession could instead be used to put them in drug treatment and rehabilitation. We know that it costs a lot of money to keep someone in jail. So it would cost a lot less money to put someone in treatment when they've been found to be using drugs rather than putting them in jail. Additionally, the stigma associated with drug use would change from being one associated with criminal activity to instead being a stigma associated with addiction being seen as a public health issue. This is important because people that are experiencing addiction might be more willing to seek treatment if they're not afraid that they would be seen as a criminal for admitting they're having a drug addiction issue. They instead would be seen as someone who's needing medical treatment and support. What are the cons of decriminalizing drug use? This will be the alternate viewpoint that I am supporting for this presentation. So to begin, if decriminalization leads to an increased supply of accessible drugs, then prices of drugs will most definitely decrease, which will encourage people to want to try to use the drugs or use them more often than what they are currently using them. According to the Foundation's Recovery Network, people may be more likely to experiment with drugs if they do not fear being legally prosecuted. And according to Califano, the US has some 60 million smokers, up to 20 million alcoholics and alcohol misusers, but only 6 million illegal drug addicts. His point is that if illegal drugs were easier to obtain, if they were cheaper in cost, then these figures would change. So with the decreased price of drugs that would come with decriminalizing drug use, it's more likely that people who are currently using illegal drugs would not only use them more often, but that amount of people using them would increase as well. An example Califano gives is that in Italy, where personal possession of a few doses of drugs like heroin has generally been exempt from criminal sanction, Italy has one of the highest rates of heroin addiction in Europe, with more than 60% of AIDS cases attributable to intravenous drug use. So here he argues that by allowing people to use drugs without any concern of criminal sanction, that they will not be responsible with the amount of drugs that they're using. They might not be safe with the needles that they're using, which can contribute to diseases like HIV and AIDS. But it would also increase people trying other drugs as well. Statistical data supporting why drugs should not be decriminalized. So an elasticity estimate shows the percentage change in quantity consumed resulting from a 1% change in price. When rising prices reduce consumption, the estimate has a negative sign and thus an elasticity of negative 1%, that a 1% increase in price results in a 1% reduction in quantity demanded. Britfield-Jensen is saying here that by increasing the accessibility to drugs that are not currently legal, they would decrease in price, which would allow people to have a higher demand for them, because more people would want the drugs if they aren't as expensive as they currently are. And as we know, as we mentioned in the previous slides, you can expect that prices would decrease for drugs if they were legalized, because people wouldn't have to put as much risk into getting the drugs and possessing them and dealing them. So they wouldn't have as many ramifications to be confiscating with the money that they'd charge for the drugs themselves. Britfield-Jensen also specifies that the reported price level of heroin has fallen dramatically over the years, whereas the average monthly consumption has more than tripled. Here she is saying that an example is very clear that by decreasing the price of drugs and allowing people to have more accessibility to them, the consumption of them has increased. So by decriminalizing drugs, we are not making it safer for people to use drugs. We are allowing them to use them more freely, which in return actually allows more people to be using them because they don't have as high of a risk of attaining the drugs, dealing the drugs, which encourages people to not have to charge as much for the drugs. And as Britfield-Jensen explains, consumption of drugs will then increase because it's easier to attain them. So that is something just to consider as an alternate viewpoint. Typically, I agree with the pros associated with this policy, but for this assignment, I wanted to support the alternate viewpoint of not decriminalizing drug use. Thank you for listening. Take care.